This is Jeffrey Jackson. This guy is a Jehovah's Witness governing body member. Doesn't get much higher up than he is. Back in 2015, he was called to testify in front of the Australian Royal Commission. He was called to testify there because of Jehovah's Witnesses' poor handling of child mistreatment, CSA, within the religion. They very obviously suck at protecting children. It's terrible. So they were called to testify, and guess what? He lied the entire time. Dude lied. It was crazy to listen to. This is actually, I think, part 4 or something. If you haven't seen the others, don't sweat it. This stands independently of the rest. I'll give context if it's missing. But he's about to get into the Elder's Handbook, which, by the by, these people are not even supposed to know about. The Elder's Handbook is a closely guarded secret. People don't even know it exists within the religion. I certainly didn't know it existed. So let's listen to Jeffrey Jackson talk about the Elder's Handbook and lie some more to a government official. This is where he starts talking about the Shepherd the Flock of God book, which is the Elder's Handbook. Oh boy, I can't imagine this guy's happy about having to talk about this book on record. And while we listen to this, we're going to play some Breath of the Wild. If you haven't played it before, no big deal. It'll just be in the background.
I'd like to refer you to Shepherd the Flock of God, which is tab 120 at page 71, ringtail 72.
I'm probably going to cut out blank space when this is playing, so it's just like, if it's like a really long gap, you won't even realize that I just cut it out.
Now, this is the manual for elders, and it's been applicable since, as I understand it, 2010. Is that right?
This is, yes.
Yeah, so they have a 2010 edition. I forget which editions they have, actually. I have a copy of all of them. Again, you're not even supposed to have copies of this stuff. You're not supposed to know they even exist. I have the 2010 edition, the 2022 edition, the 2022 addendum, and the 2021 edition of it. And I think I also have like the 1980-something. Yeah, 91. I have the 1991 edition also. Yeah, pretty interesting.
That appears to be the case.
And would it be the case that this manual came through the processes of the writing committee?
This manual would have been prepared with the help of the service departments, and the service committee would have prepared this information. And yes, the writing committee wouldn't have needed to read everything and check to see it's scripturally applicable.
Yes.
God, I can't believe he's actually like talking about this book right now.
And what I'm showing you page 71, but that's in chapter 5, which is headed determining whether a judicial committee should be formed. And
right, so if you don't know what a judicial committee is, it's basically a group of 3 elders that come along and hear about some sin that somebody committed. They smoked a cigarette. They drank alcohol when they were too young. They have a girlfriend on the outside world or something like that. They hear about this. They form a judicial committee, and the judicial committee votes, basically, on whether or not that person should be excised from their community permanently. Should they be allowed to talk to their friends and family that they grew up with, or banned from speaking to them for the rest of their lives? That's basically what a judicial committee is.
And it starts out by setting out various wrongdoings, serious ones, including manslaughter, attempted suicide, premier, and so on. So that's
You're right. So he's listing the things that are disfellowshipable offenses right now.
the context. But you'll see at paragraph 37, it says, even though a Christian has been accused of wrongdoing serious enough to require judicial action, a judicial committee should not be formed unless the wrongdoing has been established, and the word established is in italics. So my question is, who is it who decides whether the wrongdoing has been established?
The reason they're holding this committee hearing at all is because some people found a loophole in their system. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses operate off of something called the 2-witness rule. the two-witness rule is a Bible rule that existed for, like, contracts and stuff. You know, you want to sell somebody this donkey, then there have to be two witnesses to the transaction, or it's like it never happened. It's like a civil matter, you know? Like, it makes sure that you're protected in case somebody denies contract signings or whatever. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses picked up the two-witness rule intended for, like, civil matters and applied it to criminal matters. You can't assume that something is real unless two witnesses come forward, or two victims. So if a kid is mistreated by somebody, there have to be two victims before Jehovah's Witnesses move forward with it, or two direct witnesses. Now, the very obvious loophole that I'm sure everybody has already seen is the fact that people were taking advantage of kids and then moving to another congregation. Elders can't say a word to anybody because there weren't two victims. It's like it never happened. And they would move to a new congregation and re-offend with somebody else. And once again, the elders couldn't say a word, so they'd move to a new one. And this happened over and over and over and over again. It's the most glaringly obvious loophole in existence, right? And up to this moment right here that we're watching, they never closed that loophole. They never fixed it. Now, in their 2021 edition of their handbook, I think it was, 2021 edition, they released a new sentence in there that says, you don't have the responsibility to call the police. As an elder, you don't need to call the cops if you hear about this stuff. But it's not a sin to call the cops if the victim so chooses. So you can inform them if you'd like that they are free to call the police, but you shouldn't, you should stay out of it, basically. You should investigate to the best of your ability, and if there are not two witnesses or two victims, then leave it in Jehovah's hands, quote unquote. That's what it says, i.e., do nothing at all, pretend it never happened. That's the 2021 edition of their handbook. That's what it says. That was 6 years after this happened. That was their correction. So anyways, that's the problem here. So now they're asking this guy, how do you decide that wrongdoing is taken place? How do you know that wrongdoing is taken place? Like, who is in that committee or whatever that makes those decisions? Because it's, he's trying to draw out like the two witness rule, sounds like. And it's obviously a flawed method, right? Like, it doesn't get more obviously flawed than this. So with that context, keep listening to what he says here.
Who decides whether the wrongdoing has been established?
So it is my understanding that two elders normally would investigate the matter to see if there is some substance.
Right. Two elders investigate. Three elders do the judicial committee once it's been established.
Accusation, having in mind, as you mentioned, this could be ranging from someone getting drunk to someone committing immorality and so on. So those two elders would at least see if there was some basis of the accusation, and they would get back to the body of elders, who then would appoint the judicial committee.
Yes. So then the question is it scripturally necessary that that role is performed by two elders?
No, the investigation thing. No, it's not scripturally necessary that it's two elders. It could be women. That's what they were arguing in the previous part, if you missed it, that women should be allowed to take an investigative role, particularly in cases of, CSA, where a kid has been taken advantage of and needs to talk to somebody. Like, why does it have to be an elder? Likely somebody who looks just like the person who hurt them, possibly in a similar age, and may even have a very close relationship with that person. Jehovah's Witnesses, men are not allowed to be close friends with women and vice versa unless they're husband and wife or a family member. You're not allowed to hang around men and women. So if it were women that were doing the investigating, it would be guaranteed virtually that they wouldn't have a bias or a super close relationship with the accused. So it's a totally reasonable ask.
As opposed to, for example, a woman appointed for them.
May I ask, Mr. Stewart, is this the same question that is Honor asked, or is there a difference? Are you just emphasizing the point?
Well, I'm trying to understand your answer, Mr. Jackson. So if you can just address yourself to my question, what I've sought to do is to identify a very specific decision in the process. It's the decision as to is the wrongdoing established, and you've said that that's done by two elders who then report back to the body of elders, which then appoints a judicial committee. So I'm asking scripturally, is there room for that decision as to whether the wrongdoing has been established to be anyone other than elders?
The answer is there is no scriptural basis to bar women from being on an investigative committee. But they believe that women should have no role in anything at all at any point ever, even if it would be beneficial to victims. So the answer is no, they can't be, basically. But he doesn't want to come out and say that right now, I guess.
Good. I understand your question, Mr. Stewart. Could we take the case of where the two elders cannot speak to the victim, that perhaps they don't want to traumatize the victim, and maybe two women that are very close to the victim are able to speak to them. In a setting such as that, all the elders would have is the testimony of the two women with regard to the testimony of the victim. So in that way, the women are saying whether they feel that it's a valid case or not.
I don't think I understand what he's saying right now.
So the answer to your question is yes, women can be involved scripturally.
Well, okay. He's saying, can women be witnesses? We're not talking about can women be witnesses. We're saying can they be investigators? And he knows that. He's twisting this around intentionally.
But you know, Mr. Jackson, my question had nothing to do with involvement. It had to do with who makes the decision. The person who makes the tea is involved, in a sense, if they bring the tea in when the decision's being considered. I'm not
right, exactly.
talking about involvement, I'm talking about who makes the decision. Am I to understand your evidence is that it must be elders who make the decision?
That is my understanding.
Yes. And are you able to furnish a scriptural reference for that? In other words...
No, he's not. He can't back this up scripturally.
Where it is that it's provided in the scriptures that is necessarily so.
The principle that we were discussing before is the headship principle found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I'm sure, Mr. Stewart, you've already referred to this in the commission, but please bear with me as we look at it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. You have it there already?
Well, this time I'll be grateful for the page number, Mr. Jackson.
Okay, so 1536. Thank you. So, verse 3 of chapter 11. But I want you to know that the head of every man is the Christ. In turn, the head of a woman is the man. In turn, the head of the Christ is God.
Right. So they're trying to draw out the hierarchy, like the spiritual hierarchy or whatever. Women are below men. Men are below Christ. Christ is below God. That's the idea here. Except that doesn't mean women can't have any role in adjudicating things or contributing to this or that or investigating or whatever. That doesn't mean any of that stuff. Like, what's the dude even talking about? He thinks that this is like a W for him. It's not.
So in the church decision-making arrangement is based on the headship principle we have in the family and in the Jehovah's Witness community as a whole, that Scripturally, the men make the final decisions, but that does not mean that there is no input from the women.
Well, that's what it means to Jehovah's Witnesses. He doesn't think there should be input from women. That's what's being asked right now. Can women give input on, CSA cases? Can they adjudicate or can they help investigate? And the answer in this dude's mind is no. And he's refusing to just come out and say that. He knows that the answer is no. He's lying here. He knows that he believes, and the rest of the governing body believe, women should not have a role in investigating cases of CSA. Just come out and admit it. Why is he lying?
While you're in 1 Corinthians, perhaps you would take a look at 1 Corinthians 14, verses 33 to 35.
I have it already, yes.
Which says that, for God is a God not of disorder but of peace, as in all the congregations of the holy ones. Let the women keep silent in the congregations, for it is not permitted for them to speak. Rather, let them be in subjection, as the law also says. If they want to learn something, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the congregation.
Yeah, that's really interesting he brought that up, because women do have a role in Jehovah's Witnesses, like theology or whatever. They are allowed to go to the meetings, and they're allowed to pioneer, which means they're allowed to go door knocking all the time. They go out like 50 hours a month or 70, 90 hours a month. I don't know what it is now. It used to be like 70, I think. Anyways, they're allowed to do that. And also, they're allowed to do demonstrations on Wednesday nights. For me, it changes from congregation to congregation. They used to have these demonstrations of how you'd go door knocking. And, they'd try out some of the example presentations or whatever. And they were allowed to do that. That's teaching as far as I can tell, right? So they're willing to bend the rules a little bit for women. Jehovah's Witnesses are. But not for children, apparently. Not when it's in children's best interests. They're not willing to. Fascinating, right?
As I understand it, that's not applied in the Jehovah's Witness organization. In other words, you do allow women to speak in the congregation.
I'm sorry, you have two questions there. Can I answer the first one first? Jehovah's Witnesses do follow what is stated here. I can explain. The second one is...
Not really, they don't. Not really. Women do show up and listen to stuff at the Kingdom Hall, and they do demonstrations at the Kingdom Hall too, which is teaching.
Follow what is stated here. I can explain. The second one is, yes, women are allowed to speak in the congregation. May I explain to you the reason why I feel we do follow what is here?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so you notice in verse 34, that's where it says, keep silent. But if you look up at verse 28, there it says, but if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent. So the expression keep silent is referred to a male. And then verse 30, where it's talking about prophets. And then if one, in verse 30, it says, if another one receives a revelation while sitting there, let the first speaker keep silent. So this chapter is talking about orderly conduct in the church meetings or in the congregation meetings. So in verse 28...
Okay, I don't trust their interpretation at all. He claims to be a language expert, but I have to say, Jehovah's Witnesses have straight up changed verses in the Bible. Changed words entirely. Removed words, morphed them, moved them around. Some of them don't even really make any sense why they would. But every single Bible translation contains this specific word, and even the original Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic contains these words. But Jehovah's Witnesses removed it. No explanation, no reasoning. They just took it out. So I don't trust a word out of their mouths, and I certainly don't trust his translation of anything at all.
If someone starts speaking in another language, but there's no interpreter, the scripture says, let him keep silent. Now, it appears that in the congregation there was a problem because Some women were actually challenging, arguing, debating with the men who were taking the lead in giving teaching.
Oh, yeah, they're also allowed to answer at meetings. The way they have it set up is they answer at meetings too. Women do. So women are not allowed to argue with men. They're not allowed to give their input on anything, is basically what he's saying.
Now, you may not feel that that is the case, but that's the context of what is said here. And in chapter 11, it refers to the fact that a woman...
I don't trust that that's a context. I don't trust a word out of the guy's mouth. I'd have to look it up myself, which is totally doable. You don't have to take his word for it. You can look at the interlinear version of the Bible. Just Google it, interlinear Bible, Google the verse that he's talking about, and it pops right up. You can look at what the original language said and the context behind all of it. I just don't feel like doing it at this moment. But yeah, keep listening here.
Of what is said here. And in chapter 11, it refers to the fact that a woman could speak with a head covering. So I think...
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. I totally forgot about that. Jehovah's Witnesses women will wear head coverings from time to time, depending on like what's happening in the situation. Like when I was 13 years old, 14, maybe 15, I don't remember. I think I was baptized at the time, maybe. No, I wasn't baptized yet. My mom was reading a Jehovah's Witness book with me, one of their books, and it was a rule in Jehovah's Witnesses: if a woman is teaching a man, she must wear a head covering. If she is acting as the spiritual lead of of the family, or acting as a spiritual lead over a man, she must wear basically a hijab. That's pretty much it. That's crazy, right? Is that just me? It's super interesting that he mentioned that just now, too.
With a head covering. So I think a very literal interpretation of verse 34 and 35 is not appropriate in the context.
Wow. Suddenly, he doesn't think that a literal interpretation is necessary. How about that? They think a literal interpretation is necessary in other contexts when it's absolutely not. But in this one, they don't think it's necessary. Like, for example, the story of Adam and Eve was very obviously not literal. God created, like, the earth in 6 literal days? Really? Just everything about their beliefs are nonsensical and ass backwards and contradictory. It's crazy.
Are you able to give an overarching explanation as to when it is that what is said in the Bible should be taken literally, and
there you go. That's a good question.
And when it should be given an expansive interpretation, as in this instance?
Very good. The answer is Jehovah's Witnesses. You see, it's not a matter of 7 men in the governing body taking one verse and saying, "What do you think it means? What do you think it means?" Jehovah's Witnesses try to use the Bible to explain itself. So
the hell does that mean?
Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, if we were to take the viewpoint that this literally means that a woman cannot speak, then we would be not going in accordance with the context. So the answer to your question is you have to have the whole picture, and that's something that...
That doesn't make any sense. Is it just me, or is that nonsense?
For yourself, and this is obviously said in all due respect, someone who reads the Bible their whole life should understand the whole picture. And if I, perhaps by means of helping you with regard to that, there are 2 other scriptures. One is in 1 Timothy chapter 2, which I believe is Honor referred to in the commission. 1 Timothy chapter 2, that's page 1588. And there it says, verse 11 and 12, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but she is to remain silent." Now you notice the asterisk gives the alternative to that, to remain calm, remain quiet. So obviously this is...
To remain calm and quiet. Now, so he's saying, he's basically coming up with an excuse for why he allows women to talk in the congregations, is what it sounds like to me. Look, that's what the Bible says, okay? I'm not going to defend the shit that the Bible says if it's garbage. There's no reason to defend it, right? If it's terrible, it's terrible. But for what it's worth, I don't feel that the Bible defends shunning the way Jehovah's Witnesses practice it. They completely ignore context in that case. But they're willing to take extra context into consideration and, work themselves into a pretzel to allow women to talk in a congregation in this case.
Not jumping up excitedly, arguing with others. And it's similar to what...
What was that?
Quiet. So obviously, this is talking about the role of women not jumping up excitedly, arguing with others.
Okay, does anybody in the congregation ever jump up excitedly and argue with others? Is that something that people usually do in congregations? That's not something I ever did. Did I have the option of doing that? You know what happens if you argue with others in the congregation? You get disfellowshipped for heresy, really. I'm dead serious. It's against the rules. You are not allowed to argue with others on matters of, spiritual subjects or whatever. Certainly not allowed to argue with, what the governing body has said. That is very against the rules. So I don't know what he's talking about here, honestly. No one is allowed to do this. They'll be disfellowshipped for it. Disfellowshipped, by the by, if you're unfamiliar with the term, it means you're shunned from friends and family forever.
Arguing with others. And it's similar to what 1 Peter, and please bear with me, 1 Peter chapter 3 says with regard to a woman who is married to a non-Christian. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, that's page 1623. Mr. Stewart, have you got it?
No, I haven't, but I'm sure you'll read it to me, Mr. Jackson.
Okay. And verse 1 of 1 Peter chapter 3, in the same way you wives be in subjection to your husbands, so that if any are not obedient to the word, they may be won without a word through the conduct of their wives. Now, to take the position that the expression without a word means they would never, ever, ever speak to their husband would be a misapplication of Scripture. So the governing body, when we consider these things, is very much aware of trying to get the whole context of things. Otherwise, it's like asking two people for an opinion on something and getting three different opinions. If someone just takes one verse, they can have all sorts of opinions about it. But the work of Jehovah's Witnesses is to try and understand the whole Bible as one message from God. Now, I don't expect that you would have the same viewpoint.
Yeah, that's nonsense. You shouldn't be taking the Bible as one single cohesive message from God. It was 66 stories, 66 books by 66 different authors told across thousands of years. That makes no sense.
One message from God. Now, I don't expect that you would have the same viewpoint, but I thank you for at least letting me express our viewpoint.
Mr. Jackson.
Well, why do you think that you won't have the same viewpoint? Why is that? Do you think maybe it's because it's absurd? It's a ridiculous viewpoint to have. It's like he's this close to self-awareness.
Let's make it a little more concrete then, in a very specific example. Now, you'll know that one of the things that's emerged in the last couple of weeks, that in Australia at least, amongst the Jehovah's, or in the Jehovah's Witness organization, there's a practice of not reporting child sexual abuse allegations to the authorities unless...
Yep, that's the problem. That's why they're there in the first place, because there's a culture of not calling the outside authorities, because they're supposed to act as their own government. You're not supposed to involve the outside world in any way ever, if at all possible. Now, they have, after this, they came out and kind of changed it to say, no one's going to be disfellowshipped if they choose to call the police. But as an elder, you shouldn't be doing it. The other person, the victim, should be calling the police, if anybody at all. So let's just step back, listen again.
Or in the Jehovah's Witness organization, there's a practice of not reporting child sexual abuse allegations to the authorities unless required by law to do so.
Exactly.
Do you accept that?
I'm not familiar with the statistics or the
We're not talking statistics.
general practice, but I can tell you why there is a spiritual dilemma because of this question.
Well, that's what I'm driving at. So perhaps you can address that question specifically, which is this: is there a scriptural basis to that policy being, or practice being, not to report child sexual abuse allegations to the authorities unless required by law to do so?
Thank you for the opportunity to explain this. I think very clearly Mr. Toole pointed out that if the Australian government and all
Mr. Toole? There's a Mr. Toole? Okay.
the states was to make mandatory reporting, it would make it so much easier for us. But the ethical or let's say the spiritual dilemma that an elder has is to consider, how did he get the information that he has been told? Now, there's a scriptural principle in the book of Proverbs, chapter 25.
Before he goes on, I bet I know what he's going to say here. Why is it an ethical dilemma that you would have to report it to the police? I bet he's going to pretend that elders are like priests, basically, who are receiving confession, because that's the legal argument they used in court cases. And interestingly enough, they lost those court cases. You know why? Because elders aren't like priests. They don't operate like priests. They're not paid like priests. They're not on the payroll. They don't live in the parish or whatever the hell priests live in. They're not priests. They are administrators at best. The priests of the organization are the governing body and the writing staff. The priest in a religious organization passes information down to the people. It explains the theology and proselytizes and stuff. Elders are not priests. They are there to provide the information that is being given to the people. I mean, they're receiving the information too. They're nothing more than normal members of the organization also. All of the information flows from the top down. Court cases and judges and juries have determined that elders are not considered priests and thus are not protected under church or priest penitent privilege or whatever it's called. They're not protected from like reporting anything under protected privilege, whatever it is.
Now, there's a scriptural principle in the book of Proverbs, chapter 25, and I'm not saying, Mr. Stewart, that any one of these principles takes precedent, but it is something that the elder would need to take into consideration. So Proverbs 25, verses 8 through 10. That's on page 905. That's Proverbs 25, 8 through 10. Do not rush into a legal dispute, for what you will do.
Oh, they're setting up the two-witness rule, I believe, right now. They're talking about a legal dispute, right? The legal dispute that they're referring to, it's like a civil matter. You know, you're trying to sell a donkey to somebody, and that person lies and says that you didn't try to sell the donkey or something like that, or they didn't pay you or whatever. That's the two-witness rule. That's why it exists. And they're applying this to criminal matters, not just like civil matters, right? Listen again.
Do not rush into a legal dispute, for what you will do later. For what will you do later if your neighbor humiliates you? Plead your case with your neighbor, but do not reveal what you were told confidentially, so that the one listening will not put you to shame and you spread a bad report that cannot be recalled. Now,
maybe that wasn't a two-witness rule. I guess they're probably talking about just bearing false witness or something.
I'm not saying, Mr. Stewart, this is the only factor, but it is one factor that all ministers of religion have grappled with when it comes to an issue such as this. The second issue is that elders are told, as is mentioned in 1 Peter, and the 5th chapter, this is on page 1625. 16:25, 1 Peter chapter 5, and verses 2 and 3. Have you got it, Mr. Stewart?
I do.
Yes. Shepherd the flock of God under your care, serving as overseers, not under compulsion, but willingly before God, not for love of dishonest gain, but eagerly, and then this is the point, not lording it over those who are God's inheritance, but becoming examples to the flock. The point being here, another aspect that an elder needs to consider is he does not have the authority to lord it over or take over control of a family arrangement where a person who, let's say it's a victim who is 24, 25 years of age, has a right to decide whether or not they will report that incident. They also respect the family arrangement that the appointed guardian, who is not the perpetrator, has a certain right to.
Oh, I see. Interesting. So he's saying, just let me draw out a hypothetical, because this is a hypothetical that they're building off of. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in having friends with outsiders, right? They don't like having any connections with somebody who is not a Jehovah's Witness, right? Now, that means that whoever took advantage of somebody, of a kid or whatever, is a Jehovah's Witness. That's just how it works. If they were outsiders, they wouldn't care. So in this situation where a Jehovah's Witness has taken advantage of somebody, it should be taken far more seriously in their minds, because they don't want a bad reputation on Jehovah. They don't want to reproach Jehovah's name is how they refer to it. That's what it's called. Oh God. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, no. Okay. This is very difficult to do correctly. Holy Christ on a cracker, dude. This is just chaos right now. Oh God. Okay. Okay, we're good. We're good. I got it. Oh God. I can't step in that mud. Didn't see the mud. Okay, we're good. See? We're good. Oh God. We're not good yet. Okay, we're good. Sorry. Whew. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, if somebody has taken advantage of somebody else, they are a Jehovah's Witness. And Jehovah's Witnesses are obsessed with not bringing reproach on Jehovah's name, quote unquote. They don't want to involve the outside world because it would look bad if they did. Now, in reality, any given population has somewhere in the range of 5%, 1 to 5% predators who are out to harm people in the congregation or in the whatever. The question is, how are you going to deal with that when it happens? The Catholic Church chose to move them from parish to protect them, hide them from the law. Jehovah's Witnesses chose to refuse to change their rules or standards, refuse to call the police under any circumstances. The way that they handled it was complete nonsense. And they refused to update their guidance on it. So anyways, yeah, that's what he's talking about here.
To decide whether or not they will report that incident. They also respect the family arrangement that the...
Right, and so he says he respects the family arrangement. If the person wants to call, then they can call the cops if they so choose. No, if you know about child mistreatment happening, CSA, call the cops. I don't care if the family arrangement doesn't want that. I don't care. This is an overt, obvious example of him protecting people who take advantage of children. He is protecting people from consequences of CSA. And why? Because he doesn't want to bring reproach on Jehovah's name. He doesn't want people to think that Jehovah's Witnesses are not good people. They run their own congregation, their own governments, effectively. They don't want anyone to think that they aren't handling things properly, so they're going to cover it up to make sure that people continue to think that they do. That's the bottom line here.
They also respect the family arrangement that the appointed guardian, who is not the perpetrator, has a certain right to. So this is the spiritual dilemma that we have, because at the same time, we want to make sure that children are cared for. So if the government does happen to make mandatory reporting, that will make this dilemma so much easier for us, because we all want the same goal, that children will be cared for properly.
Nonsense. If that's what you wanted, then open it up. Tell them to call the police, period. You have the choice of making them mandatory reporters. You can tell your people, your elders, to report it. It's that simple. Why are you waiting for the government to do something? Are you fucking kidding me? You don't have to wait for the government. You are the government for Jehovah's Witnesses. It doesn't get higher up than this guy. This is a governing body member. There are only a total of 9 of these guys, and they jointly control it. Are you serious? You want the government to take steps to force you to do the right thing? Is that what he's saying? That's what it sounds like he's saying right now.
We all want the same goal, that children will be cared for properly.
Let's take the situation in a
This is a joke, dude.
family where one of the children, let's say the eldest, reports having been abused by her father.
Yes, sorry, is there a question?
Yes, if that report is accepted as having...
I wasn't paying any attention on Breath of the Wild. It's just running. I should have been paying closer attention.
Validity.
Yes, sorry, is there a question?
Yes, if that report is accepted as having validity, you would accept that the potential is that the other children in the family remain at risk.
That is correct.
And by not reporting to the authorities, is the case not that the confidentiality of the one who reported is regarded as being more important than to protect those who are still at risk?
Exactly. That's a good question. So basically what he's asking here is, damn confidentiality. Nobody cares. If somebody is being taken advantage of in a home with 3 kids, one of them has reported being taken advantage of. I don't care about confidentiality, and you shouldn't either. You should care about protecting children. That's the bottom line. And he's saying, darn it, if only the police would force me to do the right thing. I'm so disappointed, you know? I wish they would force me to do what I'm supposed to do. Give me a break. Do the right thing.
No, Mr. Stewart, if I could just, what I'm trying to highlight is there are several factors that make it hard for a minister of religion to make a clear-cut or quick decision on this matter. Obviously, I think...
No, it's not difficult to make the right decision here. Call the cops. Call the cops. If something is happening, call the police. And you're aware that it's happening, as he's saying in this situation. How can he possibly say this with a straight face? Really? You know why this is so ridiculous? Because Jehovah's Witnesses operate out of every country, to my knowledge, except for 7, I think, like North Korea and others. I think they operate out of China secretly. But anyways, they operate out of all of these countries. And they're saying if only, Australia would make us do the right thing, then we would be so much happier. Well, what about the other countries? You should be doing the right thing, period. There are, 192 countries on planet Earth now, right? Okay, if Australia and the U.S. and Germany make you do the right thing, what about the other 189 countries out there? What about them? It just blows my mind that they're so ridiculous. He's straight up saying, I wish we could, but that's just how it is. We just can't do the right thing. That's just how it works, I
think, again, what has been a cut or quick decision on this matter. Obviously, I think, again, what has been highlighted to the Commission, the elders should encourage the the guardian of the child or whoever is in that family arrangement that is not the perpetrator to notify the authorities.
No. The authorities should be notified, period. I don't care what is going on. If somebody finds out about this, the authorities should be notified. And that includes Jehovah's Witness elders. There's no excuse for it. None.
Leaving aside the question of overriding mandatory law from the civil authorities, do you see the possibility within the scriptures as you've identified them for a change in the practice of Jehovah's Witnesses? In other words, would it be within the scriptures for the Jehovah's Witness organization to adopt a policy which says that in cases where there are others at risk, a report must be made to the authorities?
That's an interesting question. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight because this happened in 2015, and this is like years and years later now, right? I can tell you exactly what happened as a result of this whole thing. The answer is they changed their elder's handbook to say, if the family, here are the instructions for elders. Elders are told if the family chooses to call the police, they are free to without having to worry about being disfellowshipped. It's not a sin to call the cops if the family chooses to. You keep your mouth shut. That's the change that they made in the 2021 edition of the Elders Handbook. It's 6 years after this meeting happened, after this Australian Royal Commission thing took place. They made that one change. So the answer really here is no, we're not changing anything. We're keeping it exactly the same as it is right now, and you can stuff it.
There are others at risk. A report must be made to the authorities.
That is a possible thing for us to consider.
It wasn't. He just lied. They were never going to consider it.
And I think already the assumption is there that if any elder was to see that there was some definite risk, that their conscience should move them to do that. But the point I was trying to make, Mr.
So, yeah, sure. Their consciences should move them to do that, absolutely. But you know what? They don't. Because there's a culture within Jehovah's Witnesses that you're not supposed to call the cops ever. Don't involve outside authorities under any circumstances. That's the rule. That's what it's all about. And the reason is because they believe the end is coming any 5 minutes now, and if you involve the outside authorities, then it exposes the organization to more risk when the end finally does come. Because they'll have a relationship with them, they'll know where they operate out of, and they'll be involved in the communities and everything else. You never involve outside authorities, ever, under any circumstances. That's the culture for Jehovah's Witnesses and for the elders specifically. So he says their consciences should move them to do that. Yeah, they should. But you know what? These guys, the governing body members, have molded the consciences of the people involved, of the elders. They've molded them into what they wanted them to be. They've modeled them into clones of each other. And by doing so, have virtually guaranteed they're not going to call the cops under any circumstances. So, yeah, this is completely made up, and he knows it is. He knows that people across the world, elders across the world, all 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses, or whatever it's up to now, are going to suffer because those elders believe that it's wrong to contact outside authorities. He knows their consciences aren't going to move them to do that because he formed their consciences through brainwashing.
But the point I was trying to make, Mr. Stewart, is there are other scriptural factors that maybe make that a little complicated, and it was certain...
No, it's not complicated. It's pretty straightforward, actually. If you find out somebody has been taken advantage of as a child, call the fucking cops. Call the cops. Nothing complicated about it. Call the police. It's pretty straightforward, actually. What could possibly complicate this? This is just stupid. What are they thinking, really? What a joke.
Scriptural factors that maybe make that a little complicated, and it would certainly be a lot easier if we had mandatory laws on that.
But you're not going to get them in every country that you operate out of. So people are going to suffer because they don't want to do the right thing. They have to be forced to do the right thing. Give me a fucking break. This is ridiculous. See, this is what I'm talking about right here. Jehovah's Witnesses watching this will know how obscene it is for them to say something like this.
Laws on that.
Now, turning to another aspect that we've dealt with, which is the question of the two-witness rule.
Right, I mentioned the two-witness rule earlier also. Again, it's just a system that was outlined in the Bible to protect people from, like, having somebody take advantage of them in a contract. You know, it's a civil thing. If you buy a donkey from somebody, the two-witness rule will guarantee that you get paid and that the guy gets the donkey, basically. It was a civil thing, not a criminal thing.
You will be aware that if there's no confession, then two witnesses to serious wrongdoing are required, or to two similar events of serious wrongdoing, in order that there is sufficient evidence to establish a judicial committee. Do you understand that?
I do understand that.
So now he's talking about the fact that if there aren't two victims, if two people haven't been taken advantage of directly by this person, then no judicial committee will be established, i.e., they're going to leave it in Jehovah's hands, quote unquote. They're just going to let what happens happen, which is a quick way to get more kids abused. It was very obviously taken advantage of, you know, over the past 30 years in just disgusting ways. People would take advantage of somebody and then move to a new congregation. Since they weren't allowed, since the elders weren't allowed to reveal that this person took advantage of somebody because there aren't two victims, they would just keep quiet. The guy would move to a new congregation. Nobody had any idea. He would reoffend. And then he'd move to a new one. And this just kept happening over and over and over and over again. Hundreds of people were taken advantage of by predators who were using that loophole in the system. And did they close that loophole? Not really. No, they didn't. They still have the two-witness rule in effect to this day. Now, if they just called the cops, it'd be one thing. They did close the loophole where, like, if there's been an accusation, then they will pass it along if they switch congregations. They closed that one. But they still need two witnesses to testify that somebody attacked them, or two victims, before they can disfellowship. So this person gets to remain part of the congregation. Anyways, the Elder's Handbook actually says if somebody has been accused of something, call the branch committee's lawyers, their legal department. Not call the cops. It says call the branch committee's legal department and inform them. That sounds like prepping things for a cover-up to me, honestly.
Is there a scriptural basis to that?
Right, so is there a scriptural basis to the two-witness rule? There is in civil matters, not in legal matters, like not in criminal matters.
The two-witness testimony, is that what you're asking, Mr. Stewart?
That's right.
Absolutely. If I could take you to the book of Matthew, chapter 18. Matthew 18. And that's on page 1330. Matthew 18.
Yes,
and here are
16.
the words of our Lord, verse 16, that's correct. The words of our Lord Jesus Christ. But this is talking in this.
For what it's worth, the only gospel that you should even consider, in my opinion, is the book of Mark. That was the first gospel. Matthew and Luke based their, writings off of Mark. Mark was the first testimony. It was the first gospel. John doesn't even belong in the Bible. That was written way, way later, and it wasn't written by anybody who was even there. And again, they used like Matthew and Luke as a source rather than the original, which was Mark. And they all have glaring differences between each other. You shouldn't even be reading Matthew, Luke, or John. Just read Mark if you want the story. And even that has its issues because there are differences all through the different manuscripts that we have of Mark. But okay, he's going to read from Matthew. Let's listen.
The words of our Lord Jesus Christ. But this is talking in the sense of a judicial setting. And if he does not listen, take along with you one or two more, so that on the testimony of two or three witnesses, every matter may be established. So from this, and I can give you a list of several other scriptures, but I don't want to test your patience and take you to all these verses. But basically, this is a theme right through the Christian Greek scriptures, the New Testament, that the rules for evidence for a judicial hearing involve two witnesses. But
yeah, for civil matters, not criminal.
Please allow me to say further. This is only talking about setting up a judicial committee. It doesn't mean to say that Jehovah's Witnesses would feel that someone is totally 100% squeaky clean just because there was only one witness to the crime.
No, but it's specifically instructed in your book that you leave it in God's hands, i.e. walk away and pretend it never happened, if two witnesses do not come forward, or two victims. Doesn't mean they're squeaky clean, sure, but it means you walk away from the problem entirely. You pretend it didn't happen.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by 100% squeaky clean. I mean, the reality is if there's only one witness in the case of child sexual abuse, then it cannot be taken further by the elders.
There you go. Exactly right.
And as it's put in the literature, it's left in the hands of Jehovah.
Yep.
Yes, but please may I correct your comment on that with all due respect. You see, by squeaky clean, I'm meaning that it's not like someone being exonerated by a judicial hearing whereby there's double jeopardy and they can't be taken before the judicial hearing again.
Okay. I don't care? Like, why is he even saying this? When I say squeaky clean, I mean, we can bring this up later if a second witness comes forward. Great, fantastic. That doesn't help anybody right now. What is he talking about? Really?
Our literature has said, and we agree, that...
I don't give a shit what your literature has said. Notice he's quoting from literature now and not the Bible? Really?
Our literature has said, and we agree, that in most cases with children with child abuse, they are telling the truth. That's an established thing. They're not making up these stories. So immediately the elders would put into place protection measures.
No, they don't. That's the problem. That's why you're sitting in this fucking chair. Because they don't put into place like protection methods or whatever. That's the issue. They don't do that. They act as though nothing happened. They leave it in Jehovah's hands, quote unquote.
To help, to make sure that the family cares for the child and that due steps are taken to protect the child.
No, they don't. That's the issue. They leave it in Jehovah's hands. They pretend it never happened because they can't prove it, quote unquote, because there weren't two witnesses. Even if they, I'll just leave it at that. Because they can't prove it, quote unquote, because there aren't two witnesses. It's simply absurd. This dude's a joke. You know what they should do? This is what they should do. I would be so happy if they just put in the thing, call the cops. Call the cops. If they can't prove it but with two witnesses or rock solid evidence, they do nothing at all. Like a photograph or something would have to come forward before they do something about it without two witnesses. But you know what they should do? They should call the cops because cops have access to equipment and scientists and all kinds of stuff that will help them get to the bottom of the matter, whether there are two witnesses or not. Like, police have access to, like, fingerprint scanners and, DNA swabs and all kinds of stuff to find this stuff out, to get to the bottom of it. If they called the police would be able to put the full force of the justice system to work against this, to find the real answer. And you know what? If the person's innocent, if they really didn't do it, they can find that out too. They can exonerate. What can your ass do? You can poke around and look through their stuff and ask people in their lives if they've ever done something questionable around their kids, and then leave it in Jehovah's hands. Thanks. Thank you for that.
Due steps are taken to protect the child.
So I take it you say that is what elders around the world should definitely do.
They should do, because Christian principles indicate if they if they realize a child is in a dangerous situation, action should be taken. The judicial hearing is simply us determining whether a person, the perpetrator, has committed a sin that would warrant them being put out of the congregation. But that doesn't mean to say we're stupid and that we think that someone hasn't done something.
Yeah, see, the problem is if they have done something, they should be charged with a crime. They're treating this like a sin and not a crime. That's really the issue here. So somebody called in the other day with a voicemail, and they asked me, they'll disfellowship for sneezing practically. How is it that people who commit CSA get away with it without being thrown out of the church? And the answer is CSA is a really serious crime, and it should be treated as serious, right? The police should be involved. The problem is if they can't unequivocally prove that they've done this thing, then it's as if they didn't do it at all. And they refuse to involve the police unless they can unequivocally prove it because they don't want to bring reproach on Jehovah's name. It works the same with, somebody smoking a cigarette. If they can't unequivocally prove that they smoked a cigarette through two witnesses watching it happen, then they'll wait. They'll just sit on it. They won't do anything about it. But they know eventually it'll come up because, Jehovah's Witnesses are nothing if not gossips, and if anybody in the congregation knows anything at all, then it'll eventually come out. Child predators have had years, some of them decades, to hone their craft and get really good at hiding it from the world. That's why the cops need to be involved.
Well, I want to take you back then to the scriptural basis for that. So you've referred to Matthew 18, verse 16, and as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in turn really is a reference back to Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. In other words, what Jesus Christ was doing is referring back to that aspect of Mosaic law dealing with evidence.
He did quote, as he often did, from the...
Wow, that's really interesting. So Jesus was referring to Mosaic law. Now, here's the thing about Mosaic law. What that is, it's like the 10 commandments, basically. There weren't just 10, by the way. There were 613, at least. There were even more than that, really. And that is Mosaic law. It's like, don't eat shellfish, don't eat pork, don't wear cotton and linen blends, don't lie, don't blah, blah, blah. Go down the list. There's a ton of stuff. 600 and something of them, right? That's Mosaic law. When Jesus came back and died for everybody's sins, he did away with Mosaic law. It was erased. It was fulfilled. It was done. You don't have to follow the 613 commandments anymore, and that's why people eat shellfish. That's why people eat pork now, right? Because we're done with it. So what this guy's saying is the governing body member is referring back to the Mosaic law as evidence for why we should be following the two-witness rule, when in fact Jesus fulfilled the law and we shouldn't be following that anymore. That's an interesting position. Personally, I would have gone with the argument that this was for civil matters rather than legal matters. And, this is like the Old Testament and it's irrelevant now.
The Mosaic law, but he gave it Christian application.
But that is an element to be found in the Mosaic law as set out in Deuteronomy 19:15, is that right?
It is an element that is found in both the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Now, what I'm interested in is, and perhaps you can...
Well, it's found in the Old Testament and it's referenced in the New Testament.
Help me on this, is that why that applies to a case of sexual assault when clearly what was being addressed in the reference in Matthew that you gave us was not a question of sexual assault.
Right, it was a civil matter, not a criminal matter. That's what he's saying.
Yes, if I can just clarify that a little further then. There are basic principles that the Bible highlights, and I can give you 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1. Sorry, Mr. Stewart.
Yes, carry on.
You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 19. It's not just a one-off verse, but this is a basic principle for rules of evidence.
It was in the Old Testament. We don't need that anymore because we have, a complex system where police can investigate a crime and send fingerprints through CODIS and do DNA swabs and, X-rays and everything. Humanity has advanced so rapidly in the past 100 years, it's absurd. And they are using Old Testament techniques to get to the bottom of it. And people are suffering as a result. That's really the issue here.
Found in the Bible. But if I could just emphasize again, this is only referring to a church-appointed committee that determines whether a person should remain in the congregation or not.
Great, then they should call the police when they find stuff out. He's saying we're not determining if this is like a crime or not. Yeah, except you're not leaving it to the police either.
The judicial system, and I'm sure if I can save the courts or the commission's time, I'm sure you're going to want to refer me back to Deuteronomy where it mentions the penalty of stoning. But what we need to remember is the laws that were given back in the nation of Israel. You had the judiciary, you had the punishment system, everything combined together. When the Christian arrangement came about, with our Lord Jesus Christ giving us direction, the Christian church does not have the authority to throw people into prison, to execute, or to do anything to them.
Exactly. So that's interesting he brings this up. Jehovah's Witnesses don't have the authority to imprison or, execute or anything. They have no penal consequences. So here's what they do. Since they don't have any way of punishing somebody for doing something wrong, they separate them from their friends and family permanently. That is their method of punishing somebody for doing something wrong. They can't put them in a physical prison, so they put them in a mental prison.
So the judicial system in the Christian arrangement involves the spiritual cleanliness of the congregation, and the rules of evidence remain the same all the way through.
Well, Mr. Jackson, that's exactly the point I want to get to. You'll be familiar, and perhaps we can go to Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27.
My favorite verse is Deuteronomy 18:22, I think. It basically says, if somebody falsely prophesies, they're to be put to death. And you'll know that they're falsely prophesying when they say something that doesn't come true. And if they do, you should ignore them. That's basically what it says. Now, I don't stand for anybody being put to death. I'm very against death penalty. But the idea is sound. Jehovah's Witnesses don't seem to... the governing body, they don't seem to get that they falsely prophesied. The Bible has a very specific prescription for how to deal with what they've done. And that is, they should at the very least lose their congregation. They should be removed from leadership positions because they lied. They blatantly, flat out lied to people. They said they heard the voice of God and they did not. So that was 4 chapters earlier than what they're quoting here. I just want to go on that little rant for a second is all.
23 to 27.
Page 304. Mm-hmm. So where it said that if a man is found lying down with a woman who is the wife of another man, both of them must die together. Now, let me just preface this. I'm not addressing the question of the stoning. I'm addressing the question of evidence. The man who lay down with the woman as well as the woman. I read that badly. Both of them must die together. The man who lay down with the woman as well as the woman. So you must remove what is bad out of Israel. Then it says, if a virgin is engaged to a man and another man happens to meet her in the city and lies down with her, you should bring them both out to the gate of that city and stone them to death. The girl, because she did not scream in the city, and the man, because he humiliated the wife of his fellow man. So you must remove what is evil from your midst. And then the next example is the one I'm particularly interested in. If, however, the man happened to meet the engaged girl in the field, and the man overpowered her and lay down with her.
The guy is saying, basically, if somebody is stoned to death, if somebody is caught committing adultery, they should be stoned. That's what he's saying, right? That's what he's referring to right now.
And the man who lay down with her the man who lay down with her is to die by himself, and you must do nothing to the girl. The girl has not committed a sin deserving of death. This case is the same as when a man attacks his fellow man and murders him, for he happened to meet her in the field, and the engaged girl screamed, but there was no one to rescue her. So the point of this last example is that there's no second witness, is there? Because the woman's in the field, she screamed, but there was no one to rescue her.
Oh, that's super interesting. So the guy gave an example of them not using the two-witness rule in the Old Testament. It sounds like the Old Testament, right? Deuteronomy 22, I think. So there are cases. Okay, the point here is they didn't use the two-witness rule for criminal things. They very specifically did different things for criminal acts. Two-witness rule is only for civil acts.
Could I explain, Mr. Stewart, that, you see, I think already under testimony, some of Jehovah's Witnesses have explained that the two witnesses needed can be, in some cases, the circumstances. I think, was it an example given?
Dude, what is he talking about?
I'll come to that, Mr. Jackson.
Okay, so
we'll get through this a lot quicker and easier if we just address it one step at a time. So the present step...
So the answer to your question?
The present step is this, is that in that example you accept it's a case where there was no other witness beyond the woman herself.
Thus proving that it applies to civil matters, not criminal matters. Right. Just blowing a hole right in their theology.
There was no other witness beyond the woman herself.
There was no other witness except the woman herself, but added to that were the circumstances.
Yes, well, the circumstances were that she was raped in the field.
And alone, with no witnesses. This is a direct one-to-one comparison to CSA. One witness, one victim. That's it. Just one. And they took action despite there only being one witness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but they were circumstances.
And it was sufficient, there being only one witness, it was nevertheless sufficient for the conclusion that the man should be stoned to death.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now, is it...
I think we're agreeing on the point.
Yes, is it not the case that had Jesus been asked about a case of sexual abuse, he may have referred back to this part of Deuteronomy and said that it's not required to have two witnesses?
I certainly would like to ask Jesus that, and I can't at the moment. I hope to in the future.
What a cop-out, dude. Are you kidding me? This is the equivalent of saying, well, this is just speculation. What a joke, dude. This guy is just a joke. This is just a joke. Dude was given an example that contradicts his beliefs directly and says, well, I mean, I guess we're just going to have to ask Jesus who was right. He's supposed to be able to talk to God. He's supposed to receive divine prophecy. What happened to being one of God's anointed people? What happened to that?
But that's a hypothetical question, which if we had an answer, then we could support what you said.
Well, it's hypothetical in a sense, but really what I'm driving at is the scriptural basis, and you the scholar, I'm not, is the scriptural basis to the two-witness rule really so solid, or is there not space for your governing body to recognize that in cases of sexual abuse, it need not apply?
Oh, it very obviously does have space. I mean, he just provided an example. If there's an example of it, that means there is absolutely space.
Again, if I could just mention the fact that we've already acknowledged that circumstances can also be one of the witnesses.
What? What did he say?
That circumstances can also be one of the witnesses.
Okay, so is he saying that victims can be witnesses too? There don't have to be two witnesses necessarily, but the victim can be one of the witnesses. That's not helping anything. That's not contributing to anything at all. We are exactly where we started. This is a joke, dude.
Well, I'll come to that, but my question is a different one. It's whether the scriptural basis to the two-witness rule in relation to cases of sexual abuse has a proper foundation.
We believe it does because of the number of times that principle is emphasized in the Scriptures.
Now, you'll be aware, of course, in the case of adultery, so long as there are two witnesses to the circumstances of opportunity, that will be sufficient.
Yes.
So, in other words, there needn't be two witnesses to the act of adultery itself, but only to the circumstances of opportunity.
Oh, that's super interesting. That's a really interesting point this dude just made. So you don't have to actually witness the situation. You just have to have two people who witnessed them walking into a house together. That's actually true. That's very true within Jehovah's Witness theology. All you have to do to be like guilty of adultery or to be disfellowshipped for it is for somebody to see you walking into a room alone with somebody else. They don't have to witness the event.
Sorry, you would need to walk me through that a little further.
Well,
I'm not quite sure.
I was trying to do it by a shortcut, but I'll take you to the document. It's in the same Shepherd the Flock book, which is...
Sounds like this guy forgot that that the dude had access to their elder's manual.
Tab 120 at page 61. So you'll see you have paragraph 11 there.
Paragraph, yes, I do.
So this is also in the chapter dealing with determining whether a judicial committee should be formed. On the subject of evidence testified to by at least two witnesses that the accused stayed all night in the same house with a person of the opposite sex or in the same house with a known homosexual under improper circumstances. That's the heading.
Right. So if somebody walks into a room alone with a homosexual, a known homosexual, God, this is bad. They are effectively guilty of adultery. The rules are so loose for this specific thing, but strict for everything else. Fascinating, right?
And then it goes on to say elders should use good judgment in assessing the situation before forming a judicial committee. And in the second dot point, it says if there are no extenuating circumstances, the judicial committee would be formed on the basis of strong circumstantial evidence of porneia. And you'll see at the foot of the page there's an example of a married brother spending an inordinate amount of time with his female secretary, and two lines from the bottom it says later when he claims to be leaving overnight for a business trip, his suspicious wife and a relative follow him to the secretary's home and they observe essentially the opportunity of adultery to have taken place, and then those two witnesses will be sufficient to establish the case. Do you see?
That's super interesting. Oh my God, I gotta write this one down too. 152.41. Hang on. You know, I didn't even think about that. This guy is absolutely on point. This is really interesting, I think.
Will be sufficient to establish the case. Do you see that?
I do see that.
So now, in the case of child sexual abuse, it should be, should it not, that a witness to an opportunity for the sexual abuse to have taken place would be the sufficient second witness.
Yes, if there is no, what does it say here?
Extenuating.
So if two people are aware that this person was in a room alone with a kid at any point at all, if there was an opportunity for this to have taken place, then there should be a judicial committee formed. But would you be surprised to find that it's not? That they don't consider that good evidence? They consider it good evidence or sufficient evidence or whatever to disfellowship somebody for buying a pack of cigarettes. If two people see someone buy a pack of cigarettes, that's sufficient to determine they had the opportunity to smoke and they were likely to smoke, so they can be disfellowshipped for buying a pack of cigarettes, even if they didn't see him smoke it. It's sufficient if they see two people walk into a room together, alone. But that same standard of evidence is not applied to CSA. That's fascinating, actually. That's a really interesting angle he's taking.
Under improper circumstances.
So a second witness to circumstantial or corroborating evidence would be sufficient to fulfill the second witness requirement.
That's a very...
Wow, he just got himself caught in a little trap there. I love it, dude. That's awesome. I mean, this is why Jehovah's Witnesses should watch this. This is why every ex-Jehovah's Witness should see this, because it shows the hypocrisy and ridiculousness of their positions.
That's a very large question, and I think it's something that we would need to consider carefully.
A large question, he said. Would you be surprised to find out that they never made a change? They never fixed it? 8 years later, and we're still waiting for them to make sufficient changes.
Yes, well, it's just important as to whether the second witness has to be a witness to the abuse itself, or to what extent it can be, he or she can be a witness to circumstantial or corroborating evidence. So let me use an example. What about the trauma, evident trauma of the survivor? Would that be able to be taken into account as corroborating evidence?
Yes, it would need to be taken into account. And if I could mention, Mr. Stewart, these are the things that we're interested in following up on after.
And they never did. They never followed up on it. How about that, huh?
To the Royal Commission, just to make sure that everything is in place, because certainly these are the things we're interested in.
Yes, but you'll understand, Mr. Jackson, what we're interested in is how much room you have to move, as it were, to what extent you're bound by the Scriptures, and to what extent you have flexibility to change your processes.
That's right. Well, may I mention... Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
I was going to say to His Honour, would that be a convenient time for a lunch adjournment?
Mr. Jackson, what did you want to say?
I was just going to say I thought that had already been established in the hearings, but if not, certainly that's something that we need to follow up on.
Very well.
Completely full of it, dude. The dude just blatantly lied through this entire thing. It appears they're going to take a lunch. There is more to this, and I may end up watching more of it. We'll see on my channels. But wow, dude, that was fascinating. They just did they did a knockout on this guy's theology. Just destroyed it. They deconstructed it, and that was really interesting to watch. Every Jehovah's Witness, every ex-Jehovah's Witness should watch this, really. This is important stuff. Anyway, let me know what you think about it in the comments. I was fascinated by that.